So I love following that because we're hopefully trying to answer some of those questions that were just asked. And so there's a lot of motivations that I think, people would want to do this research. And for us, as many others, I'm sure in the room, there's reviewer fatigue. There's no credit. Oops, sorry. There's no credit, as one of the audience just asked a question. There's quite a bit of time. It's a time-consuming effort. It's quite that intensive, especially if you really want to do a good job, and especially if the paper is extensive, long, with an appendix and a lot of stuff to review. At the same time, there's covert use of LLMs we're all suspicious of. And as editors as well, we're finding it hard to secure a sufficient number of high quality reviews, which is quite a bit of a problem compared to how many numbers we actually invite who accept compared to, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago. But then we don't know what is the impact. So there's a question of, is that a bad thing? How good are LLMs in producing reviews compared to the gold standard that we currently have, which is, the humans, which are not perfect. So we really wanted to try to answer this question. We were genuinely interested in how good are the reviews produced by LLMs, so we tried several, compared to humans, and in what way are they good? So in this study, we actually compared, so this is a prospective study where we compared 5 large language models, and we're actually updating because there's kind of a mouse and cat game and catching up with the new models that keep coming up. So we want to make the results as relevant as possible, so we have to keep including some of these newer models. So we included these 5 models, the GPT-4o, O3, Claude 3.5, I know there's 4.2 now, Gemini 1.5 is Gemini 2, and there's 2.5 now. So we use single-shot prompting to mirror what we do with the humans, where we simply send an invitation. And the prompt generally has more or less the same guidance that every reviewer generally receives from journals. So we included data from these journals. So currently, one thing I'll note, this is a preliminary analysis. We are currently doing the full text, the full data analysis currently right now. There was some delay in terms of submitting the full data analysis, mainly due to apparent death on the team, essentially, as well as a sort of quite a bit of a health injury, all in the last couple of months back to back. So that delayed us submitting this. So I'm presenting the preliminary analysis. Hopefully the full one will be available soon, but I'll mention some of the findings that we came through. So we used a private cloud environment that is firewalled to be able to run these submissions into these models, to be able to make sure the data isn't going back to the companies to train the models. Even though we do sometimes opt out, that still doesn't completely make sure that it's not used for training. But definitely this is not used for any kind of editorial decisions for any of these submissions in these journals. So for our assessment, and this is really what sets this study apart, even though it makes it super labor intensive and very time consuming, is to actually do the ratings by editors that are actually working as experienced editors and have been for a few years, and to actually use validated tools for these ratings. So we actually rated the reviews that are by the reviewers, as well as the 2 humans for each submission. So we had 35 reviews in total, and we used the review quality instrument, which is a validated tool by some of the BMJ folks back in the late 90s, which has been validated several times since then as well. That's an 8-item tool to assess a quality of a peer review, which is usually rated from 1 to 5 on a Likert scale. Secondarily, we wanted to complement this rating and assessment with a comprehensiveness score that we developed to capture how comprehensive was the review, but also how evaluative were the comments for each aspect or each element of the submission that was covered from a comprehensiveness perspective. We also plan, and we do have a sort of a protocol in place as a for study protocol workflow, to invite the authors, the corresponding author, to also comment on the LLM reviews, as we wanted to hear their perspective as well, not just the editor perspective. And we currently do have editors that are working independently in parallel to try to assess each review. So from 35, the final data set is going to be around 1,800 reviews So that's a large number, and where each review is assessed by 2 experienced editors. That's a really intensive study, which is why it's taking so much time. From a statistics perspective, it's pretty straightforward analysis to be able to evaluate the results. And this is the preliminary analysis. So these 3 aspects of the RQI, or the quality of the peer reviews, have shown a clear winner despite the very small sample size. So there are certain aspects the LLMs are actually, they seem to be able to help with pretty well, which includes really more of a comprehensive and balanced assessment of strengths and weaknesses, not just one weakness or a few weaknesses, where most peer reviewer reviews are really concentrated on weaknesses rather than strengths. And the other aspect is they miss a lot of other weaknesses sometimes. So as we all know, as reviewers, as editors as well, when you guys see some of these reviews, the person who's an expert, they focus on a sort of a weakness they find, they drill down really deep, they go into the rabbit hole, and they produce a very well coverage of that particular weakness. But then they miss other stuff oftentimes. The other aspect here was that to have specific comments on the structure of the manuscript, to have evaluation of the flow, the tables and figures, LLMs were also consistently better. And eventually, or lastly here, the constructiveness of the review by LLMs has also been shown to be better. One thing you'll note here is the human, which is the second value, for example, constructiveness, but also the others, between the 2 parentheses, it's the standard deviation. So you can see with the human ratings, it's really more spread out. You have wider variability when it comes to the ratings and the quality of these ratings. With the LLMs, it's more concentrated. So they're more consistently getting the same level that we're finding. This is the rest of the other aspects of the RQI. So it's an 8-item scale, like I mentioned. It includes assessment of how important the research question was that included in the review, and how much so, how much coverage was there for this assessment? And then, was the study original? And you can see for these 2 aspects, you really want to know a little bit of the context around that area of knowledge in that particular study or manuscript, which is why I think humans might be coming up on top for this one, but we'll have to see when we have a larger sample size to see better signal or better way to assess better power. And then the other aspects, you see there's not really much overlap between the 2 confidence intervals. But then the rest of them, there's quite a bit of confidence interval overlap due to small sample size, obviously. This is the same data in a table format, but I wanted to include the medians as well and the interquartile ranges here, so you can see a little bit better the distributions. But essentially, it's the same results that I showed earlier. So in conclusions here, obviously, it's very preliminary, like I said earlier. But one thing we found out is that despite the smaller sample size, there's quite a bit of a signal in terms of certain aspects that LLMs might be able to help, which can then be either augmenting the human's role, or potentially you can have the human focus on the other aspects that LLMs don't really do a very good job of. The other aspect here is that not all, which I don't include here because it's still preliminary, not all LLMs were as good. So LLMs were kind of a spectrum in terms of their performance, where, for example, from the ones that we evaluated for this pilot, the Gemini ones were actually better. 1.5 Pro in particular was quite good compared to the others, but that was at the expense of length. So large language model reviews were consistently much, much longer in terms of text compared to the humans, which is why in our upcoming analysis, we're doing something more of the line of signal to noise ratio, which is really the yield from that review compared to how long that text of the review was. So humans, are known to be very concise, very to the point. LLMs are the exact opposite. Their output is very fluffy. There's a lot of stuff that no need to be there, and the signal is likely to be much lower, signal to noise ratio. But obviously, this is not to be used for any kind of decision making from an editorial perspective so far, and potentially for the foreseeable future until we get better results and more higher certainty in terms of what the comparison will be. But I wanted to also thank our team for this particular study. So we have several wonderful people. Sarah Shorter, who's right there, who's one of the wonderful people with the BMJ as well. has been very pivotal in the study, as well as some other editors that I've worked with, Juan Franco, Helen McDonald, Issam Al-Fayyad as well as Nicholas Miza and Paula Rigantini for their work, particularly when it comes to rating of these reviews in the analysis that's coming up. Happy to take any questions.
Ivan.
Ivan Ransky from the Center for Scientific Integrity and Retraction. Well, it's really interesting, and I'm wondering, and this wouldn't have necessarily shown up in the study, of course, but do we know if any LLMs are being trained on open reviews? And if so, might that eventually change things? And obviously not many journals even make them, et cetera, but I'm just curious if your thoughts, whether you know that, and if you have any thoughts on what effect that might have.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I work in training AI models too, to be honest. So that would be a great idea. The challenge there would obviously be you really want to have a very good data set to train the model on. You would probably want to start with a pre-trained model, fine-tune it on some really good data set. But where do you get that data set from? So open reviews are there, but are they reliable enough to train a model on? Or otherwise, you're just going to be reproducing those open reviews, right? So I don't know of an effort, in that direction. There might be. I'm not sure. I try to stay up to date, but there's always something new that we don't know about. But I don't know.
Yes, please.
Hi, Janina Sarrell from University of Illinois. You mentioned about the variability across like the different LLMs. I was wondering if you also have insights on the variability within the same LLM, like with a different prompt, or like if you use the same prompt again and again, do you get the same exact type of results?
So as we were developing that single shot prompt that we had used, so I can't really speak much of it because it was in the context of that effort. So it wasn't for the purpose of that, end. So I think for the most part, there's quite a bit of consistency if you use the same input as a manuscript file, for example, compared to or with a prompt. More or less, you're going to get what the prompt asked for. So if you keep the same prompt, same input, you're more or less going to be getting the same thing, but there might still be some differences here and there. And the other part is even for the same model with the same version or release, it might change actually from day to day and week to week because they still do some updates that they never speak about because they're all closed off for the most part, closed off models behind commercial companies that really want to protect their IP. So there isn't a lot of openness in terms of what is being updated oftentimes. So I don't know. Honestly, the answer is I don't know. But for the most part, they stay to be consistent if you keep them the same input in a short period of time. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi, Tim Miller from Boston Children's Hospital. So sort of integrating your talk with this sort of previous talk and sort of thinking about what are the differences, I guess I feel like there must be genre differences in how we review like a paper for a computer science conference compared to a journal. And and maybe in a computer science conference, there's an emphasis on novelty and like excitement, and in biomedical, it's more about like soundness. And I don't know whether you have any sense of or intuition of like when I'm reviewing, my excitement level might be different might be more relevant for one type of paper than for another type of paper, and whether you have sort of any intuitions about that. Well,
for our data set, it's submissions to these journals, and for the pilot, it's all BMJ submissions, so it's all medical. I go one step further. It's mostly clinical. There's no basic science research either, even if it's medical. So I can't really answer that question. But I would imagine it has to do with your prompt. It depends on what your prompt says.
Yes.
Hi, Alex Goldberg from Carnegie Mellon University. So you mentioned at the end of your talk that LLMs often are really good at writing like fluffy text and really nicely stylistically. And a lot of work on evaluating LLM generated text has suggested that evaluators may be biased by the style of the text in addition to substance. We've seen in our work using an instrument based on RQI that human evaluators can be biased by the style of peer reviews as well. Namely, if they're longer, they could be better. So I was wondering if you're thinking at all about trying to separate out the style versus substance. For example, maybe you could take the human reviews that you have and ask an LLM that doesn't get to look at the paper to make them written make them be written in a better way or in a nicer way, and see if just asking the LLM to handle the style without the substance would increase human perception of whether those reviews were good or not.
Yeah, so the answer to this is really multi-pronged. So for one reason, this is why we wanted trained editors that have experience to actually do these ratings. The other aspect is I think if you're doing a study and you're evaluating an automated tool of some sort, you can't, in my opinion, it wouldn't be a great idea to use an automated tool to do the assessment for that output of the automated tool, right? You're just having, it just wouldn't make sense. So you really want the human to get as close as possible to some sort of a gold standard. And editors tend to be hard to fool, I think, bias being one, but from the ones that I know are very hard to fool. So the last point is that's why we used validated tools for the assessment as well. So it wasn't just up to the impression of an editor, sort of an overall point. So it was very deconstructed in terms of like, what are we evaluating and how are we evaluating them? And when it comes to having the same review, which is like between 7 to 9 reviews per submission, is evaluated by 2 editors independently, we actually had to have training for these editors that are helping to make sure that when we're evaluating any of these items of the RQI, for example, we're actually understanding what that item is exactly, so that when we do get different numbers, it's not due to our different understanding of the item, but it's due to how we judged the submission or the review of the submission for that particular item, if that makes sense. So these guards help avoid that kind of pitfall in this particular study, but I think if you do an automated tool to do the ratings, it would be easier to fool.
I'm not suggesting using an automated tool. I'm just suggesting maybe also trying to manipulate your human reviews to have nicer style, to separate out the style versus substance.
Maybe I misunderstood the question.
So yeah, I guess like you have the LLM generated review and the human generated review.
Right.
And so the LLM generated review could be better on style or better on substance or better on both. You could consider also taking your human generated reviews and asking an LLM just to improve the style, sorry, while keeping whatever content the human
Gotcha.
generated, which might help you separate out.
Yeah. Yeah, so style wasn't part of what was rated at all. So the only thing close to style that may have been rated was constructiveness. So whether or not the review was constructive. So that would be the only element there. But yeah, I see your point.
Mike, online comment?
Yeah, this is somewhere, it seems like between a comment and a question. Pretty Salahamo of the Finnish Medical Journal is saying, how about 1 LLM review and 1 human review for submitted manuscripts in the future? So that could either solve problems or create more problems, but I guess what are your thoughts about that?
Well, we could have done this for the study itself, but I don't think it would have helped as much because not all humans are the same and not all reviewers, not all LLMs are the same. And if you want to get as good quality as possible, you really want to get all of them and then get to the bottom of what the output will be. So, and if they get different results, then what do you do? So that's why the study here, we can't really say LLMs are better than humans or humans are better than LLMs. Humans are never going to get replaced for 100% for a particular task like this. But then the question then becomes, can LLMs help and where? So this study really points to at least so far 3 aspects where LLMs can help. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's not entirely my question. It's interesting because the humans behave like the machines. And if you've ever sent out for peer reviews, you get a widely varying degree of accuracy of human peer review, for example. Just a comment, but please go to other questions.
Mark?
Yeah, Mark Helfand. I'm trying to figure out, I'm not sure I really get why a more complete list or accounting of strengths and limitations or strengths and weaknesses is valuable, who it's valuable to. I mean, I'm asking reviewers to review, and I'm hoping that they come up with some very important weakness that would say decisive, or some very important strengths that say, hey, pay attention, this is really important. But you were talking about the completeness of it. Is that just why do you need a complete list? Why do you need a reviewer to give you all these strengths and weaknesses? Is it just to have the decision letter have more, show that somebody noticed them? Or I'm not getting the concept of why a thorough strengths and limitations is a value.
Well, it's helpful to be able to make a decision. If I were the author, I would want a complete assessment of my submission. So that would be one point to mention at the beginning. But as an editor, to make a decision, I would want to know the content experts that I invited. Did they catch the weaknesses that exist in the submission, or did they just focus on one of them and forget the others? Same thing with strengths. Did they notice a strength, them being domain experts that I may not catch as a super great strength, for example, that is worthy of mentioning? So that would be my interest as an editor, but really my motivation from fairness perspective as an author.
That kind of goes with the idea that they're complementary in some way, not doing the same, that not serving the same purpose to the editor. You're sort of using the LLM to see how, whether the viewers miss something.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
kind of saying?
Yeah, and if you look at AI tools in more broadly in medicine, in radiology or pathology, they're really used right now and implemented as routine practice in some areas currently to try to make sure, for example, a radiologist doesn't miss a small thing, a speck at the end of an image here, or a pathologist doesn't miss something on a slide over there in the corner. So in that sense, I think it would be serving its purpose as augmenting the main task performer.
Two last brief questions and brief answers, hopefully. Back microphone, and then Nihar, also known as Darth Vader. That's the last one.
This is following up on a previous question. I was wondering, in terms of when you're seeing LLM improvements, do you plan on doing qualitative, some analysis of the content to actually assess exactly how the LLM is improving along these dimensions? So what does it mean when it's giving more constructive feedback? What does that actually look like in a review? And this might get at these questions of, is it just giving fluffy language, or is it actually providing developmental feedback that is useful for authors in terms of growing their science later?
It's straightforwardly the latter. So
really?
yes.
How have you assessed that? I mean, I'm just wondering, like, how are you doing that assessment? Because a numerical scale does not provide that information. So how are you providing that? Like,
This is where the editor's training is what we agree on in terms of how do we what do we rate as a score of 3 out of 5 for constructive assessment, for example. What do we rate as 5? What do we rate as 2? What do we rate as 1? So we'll have these details published in the paper for sure, but essentially for constructive, for example, if they're simply describing something, that's really more like a 1. If they're describing something and also mentioning how it should be done, that's more like 2 or 3. If they're doing this consistently throughout the review, that can get them to a 5 potentially, if that makes sense.
Nihar Shah from Carnegie Mellon University. I'm relaying some discussions that's happening in my community, the AI community, on extensive use of LLMs. And this is specifically about subjective aspects like interestingness, innovativeness, etc. And so there are only a handful of LLMs. And now we know that each of them have their specific biases. And therefore, if, let's say, people start using GPT-5 extensively for reviewing, it'll be Sam Altman who will decide what's considered novel, what will be accepted. And then Sam Altman will start driving what kind of research all of us do, right? So this is a problem of what's called monoculture. And it can lead to problems where it's the LLM or Sam Altman who decides where the full field goes. So what would you think about that?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the areas of weaknesses potentially moving forward, even as a society, as we rely more and more on these tools, is this cognitive offloading that we do. And when we are too used to it, where we kind of lose the skill. And this is for people that already have a skill. Talk about people that are training right now that need to develop that skill. That's an even bigger problem. And then it gets to the point where what if the servers go down? And then what happens? So there are a lot of, I think, potential issues that can spin out of over-reliance on these tools for an extended period of time. where they can essentially collectively be deciding what directions happen, and there might be more on the average in every, dimension of some sort. Yeah, I don't know what to say more. It's very reflective, that area.